Disaster had struck for young Robert of Maine. His father, William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, was robbed of his chance to conquer England by the selfish King of France. King Philip had made William fight to resist a minor German territorial claim in the Low Countries, allowing a Norwegian army to usurp the power of House Godwin. The war for Zealand killed enough of William's weary troops that the campaign for the majesty of House Normandy had to cease indefinitely. The crown that Robert was to be heir to had been snatched away and dragged into the swampy fog of Britannia. His easy life as a teenage count suddenly received a very clear focus. A crown was to sit on his head, and of those who could grant him his right, only one man remained, or one boy perhaps it should be said, the dastard King Philip. Robert needed to convince the French royal court that Normandy's claim to England was a concern of theirs. Only with the support of the bickering high nobles of Francia and Aquitania could he rally enough troops to claim a country full of veteran warriors like England. Therefore, Robert began his act. He was to be the most loyal and dedicated scion of House Capet, the French royal dynasty, so that they might be slowly fooled and folded into the hands of House Normandy. He began right away. He sent 600 troops with his compliments for the king to Paris. The king was not there, for the city was currently enduring a brief tyranny under a gang of German troops left over from the battle at Montfort-l'Amaury. Robert's bumbling man Centoul decided to lay siege to the whole city to avoid a fight with the paltry force. The Germans surrendered eventually, but the suffering caused to the city by the blockade was unlikely to sit well with Robert's would-be patrons. He had to achieve more then. Centoul took the men of Maine on a long march to the front lines of the war, Zealand. Robert had devised a plan to give the knights and nobles of the French army a lasting impression of his great destiny. Centoul had been given a forged letter from the king instructing the French armies to follow him into battle as quickly as possible. It was suitably convincing. The French army stormed the German keeps of Zealand and reclaimed the territory within days of Centoul's arrival. The same could be said for other nearby forts and towns held by German garrisons. It seemed that wherever the banner of Maine went, wherever men loyal to House Normandy went, victory quickly followed. At the same time, Robert had personally promised King Philip that Maine would deliver him from the war that so unsettled him, and that France's safety would be his foremost concern, not like his overly ambitious father. So it was that when the letter ruse was revealed to Philip, he saw it only as a genius ploy to rally the French troops. With Duke William away in England trying to extract the remains of his fettered invasion force, Robert was solely to receive the credit for the work of the Norman troops. And they were being put to work, no doubt about it. They participated in a small counter-invasion of the Holy Roman Empire, and then marched to Zealand to join the charge against a German army. The ensuing struggle was to be the decisive battle of the war. Days of brutal fighting in sharp winter air bloodied the ground in which the banner of Maine had been placed. At home, though, times were far happier. Below colourful windows and before dancing flames, a feast was held on the 1st of January 1070, celebrating Robert's 16th birthday. Among the many gifts he received was the right to rule, to claim his county as his own. The time of regents and wooden horses was over. He quickly set out from the warmth of Le Mans, riding for the war in which victory must be inseparably married to his heroic image. He met his troops on the road, marching home after their victory in Zealand. Robert halted them with his retinue, and shouted with fury untempered by the rushing of cold drizzle in the strong wind. He reminded his men that the war was not over, and that the king himself had personally commanded each and every one of them to return victorious. Some of them thought that this was what they were doing. Robert screamed at these men with a wet, lisping rasp, denouncing their selfish cowardice. How could they walk away from his duty? They were convinced, so to speak, and joined him for a march to get his face familiar in the camp of the main French army in Anno. In May, he and his army moved to Zealand again to fight an echo of last winter's battle. It was his first time seeing the action he had heard so much about in person. He was enthusiastic to get stuck in, but in truth knew little of military matters aside from his tried and tested theory that riding a horse into someone was a good way of getting things done. Fortunately, little skill was needed on the day of the battle. Robert's grumbling troops had arrived late, and once he was done trying to make his formation look neat and tidy for their advance down the right flank, the German troops had been routed by the earlier wave of attacks. It was perfect in many ways. His debatably fresh troops poured across the open flank of the enemy and surrounded their centre, in which the Holy Roman Emperor himself fought. All would see that it was Robert's attack that turned the table of the battle, as awkwardly conducted as it was. Of those who saw it, none were more elated than his father, William, who was leading the French left flank by popular demand, and who had been tasked with doing just what Robert had suddenly achieved out of nowhere. Robert's undeserved reputation as the true inheritor of William's prowess was now all but set in stone. The best thing to do now was to ensure that word of his achievements reached King Philip before anyone else attempted to say anything differently. Philip was of course delighted to hear that Robert was going to such great effort to further the French cause, especially considering that Normans were not wholly considered to even be French on account of their Viking ancestry. The plan had worked. Robert could return home, comfortably written into the history of his nation and fondly remembered by the royal court. 200 men of his county had died to give him this gift, but Robert paid that no thought, precisely the amount that the lives of serfs deserved. The next year, his levied army, bigger and better trained on account of his court-martial's drilling of peasantry, marched out again to rejoin the dragging Zealand War. The invasion of Germany was continuing, and would continue continuing until the Emperor admitted that Zealand belonged to France. Little fighting was actually taking place, so in many ways it was a nice excuse to improve Robert's PR with a pleasant march through the summery countryside and to see the sights and delights of life along the River Saône. Amid such peaceful warfare, Robert turned his attention to matters as important to the medieval nobility as any crusade: marriage. He had already been in communication with the King of Sweden in that regard, and after his partially imagined war glory had been suitably conveyed, he had secured a betrothal with his daughter, Mare. For a mere count to marry into a royal family was widely seen as a mark of a certain greatness in character and destiny that was rarely seen. The betrothal alone marked Robert as a noble of the highest order, perhaps competing already with his own father. William had married a king's granddaughter. Now Robert had landed himself one step closer to a crown. It would be a decade and more before Mare was of the age for marriage, but in the meantime other matrimonial ploys could be conducted. Robert's motivations to become a great man were matched equally by motivations to ensure that his rivals cast no shadows. No greater rival could an heir of a landed noble have than his own sibling, a male sibling of almost the same age, even more so, and that was what Richard of Normandy was. It was almost inevitable that Robert would be battling Richard, his third brother William, and even his sisters for his entire life. He was keen then to strike the first blow himself. He wanted to ensure that Richard did not secure a marriage with even a hint of the prestige that his own princess bride generated. He wrote to Duke William, informing him that in the court of Maine there was a young woman who pined for a husband, and who had an adoration for Norman life despite her own Frankish ethnicity. Robert requested formally that she be allowed to marry Richard as a sign of union between House Normandy and the neighbouring Duchy of Flanders, to which young Adelaide was tangentially related. The Duke, eager to grant the wish of the son he saw a hero in his own image, agreed at once. Richard was to marry a woman with no chance of inheriting anything, with no titles, and thanks to her, in truth, being Richard's own cousin, with a reduced chance of creating worthwhile heirs in the decades to come. The war ended at around this time, and everyone returned home, but Robert's victory over his brother far outshone the anguish of some foreign emperor. That winter, the troops marched home to Maine, but to their dismay, they stumbled into a war. Their disappointment was Robert's delight. His father had decided to declare war on the jealous Duchy of Anjou on account of the fact that Duke Geoffrey the Ill-Ruler had tried his hand at redirecting church tithes to his own estates and had become excommunicated as a result. An excommunicated man had no right to complain when a loyal Christian coveted his lands. And so, the many favours of Duke William now included this war, into which Robert and company plunged. Their advantage was absolute, and victory was certain, so it provided a suitable chance for a bit of bonding between father and son. They calmly sat together as another summer was spread over the fair land of Anjou, viewing from the safety of their siege camp how the Duke's men sneered less and less honestly from their walls with each passing day sans food. Reports arrived of how a rebellion in the Duchy of Flanders threatened to destroy France with far more likelihood than the encroachment of the Germans, but that summer the Normandy family wasn't having any of it. They sat back, held out their cups into an endless flow of wines and ales, and waited for the godless Geoffrey to surrender his lands. Then, a familiar twist of fate reversed Robert's fortunes. The Pope, foolishly pitying the plight of the people of Anjou, had overturned his judgment of Geoffrey and ordered the Norman troops to cease practicing their violent ambitions against peoples who were, upon a costly further inspection, loyal to God. There was no end to the curses that Robert invoked for this injustice. That the king had stolen away his kingdom was one thing, but now an even higher and more untouchable power was stealing away even his meagre right to a more significant duchy. What was to be next? Would he receive a vision from God himself telling him that the chicken he'd been looking forward to for dinner had been carried away by ants to service some unknowable end? Such questions induced a sulk of royal proportions, subjecting the court of Le Mans to regular outbursts at the merest slight for the better part of a year. Finally, his bruised servants were relieved to hear that Duke William was taking Robert to the other side of Normandy to begin the next step in winning the command of the king. The Normans would end the French Civil War in the king's favour, and furthermore stop the chaos it was causing from spilling over into their ultimately indifferent domain. So, the last of Robert's teenage life would pass on this long and underwhelming campaign, fighting only to please his father and his liege, the two guardians of his future crown. After all the effort he was putting in, there was no way he would let either of them get away without giving him all that he deserved.